Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again for joining us for the SIEW Energy Insights webinar. My name is Kylie, and I'm your host from the Energy Market Authority. Today's webinar on LNG and hydrogen in the energy transition is held in partnership with S&P Global Platts, organizer of the SIEW partner event, LNG and Hydrogen Gas Markets Asia Conference. I would like to invite you to participate in our polls on menti.com. The instructions are displayed in the chat. Please do share your thoughts with us as we will be discussing the results later during the program. You can use the Q&A tool to send our panelists questions throughout the webinar. Be sure to include whether your question is directed at a particular speaker along with your name and organization. I would now like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Dexter Wang, Asia Market Engagement Manager, S&P Global Platts, who will be presenting key takeaways from the report, The Hydrogen Economy. Can natural gas and hydrogen have a symbiotic relationship? Mr. Wang, please.
Thank you, Kali. My name is Dex Swan. I'm in charge of market engagement across energy sectors in APAC. For those of you who are less familiar with Platts, we're a price reporting agency that provides benchmark pricing and analytics in the energy and commodity sectors. I present to you some findings from the research of my colleagues at Platts Analytics regarding the interplays between LNG and hydrogen. Next slide, please. COVID-19 has significantly altered the energy transition outlooks, but the business as usual scenario has not been transformed. There are some accelerants from COVID-19. Their weaker macro deflates overall demand growth, allowing clean alternatives to fossil fuels to take greater share. Changes in behavior ranging from working from home to less air travel to shorter supply chains. There are policy changes that are designed to quicken and the move away from fossil fuels, the green stimulus and net zero. But there are also deterrents from COVID-19. You have the macro and energy demand to recover as individuals and business desire to return to normal. I'm sure many of you in the audience are already returning to the office, which would drive up the energy consumption in the CBD of your city and also the fuel consumption in the transport sector. Also, there's preference for personal vehicles over public transport for the countries which have higher car ownership, which would again support the gasoline and diesel demand. There's also lower fossil fuel price comparing with the pre-COVID, which makes transition away from fossil fuel to cleaner alternatives more costly. Next slide, please. Zero carbon hydrogen can decarbonize historically challenging sectors with varying degree of efficacy and challenges. In many of these cases, it displaces natural gas and LNG. Depending on the technology and process involved, from the left to the right of the chart, you see the sectors which may see higher consumption of hydrogen with increasing adjustments involved. As you can see, blending hydrogen in natural gas grid would mean highest amount of hydrogen consumption, while the production of ammonia would mean the highest amount of abated CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. The relative cost advantage of hydrogen production technologies are highly regional, are correlated with energy prices, capex, and capacity factor. Theoretically, hydrogen can be made from LNG, but that would be a rather expensive pathway and relatively higher emitting versus renewable hydrogen via electrolysis. Renewable hydrogen can be cost effective or cost competitive with low carbon hydrogen from high cost gas, even under current technologies. Next slide, please. And after COVID, natural gas role in energy transition as a bridge fuel is getting shorter and narrower. There deflationary pressure on gasoline, on gas demand. The total energy demand has been severely curtailed from COVID-19, limiting the potential gas growth prospects. The net zero and other green policies will push in more renewables or hydrogen and reduce natural gas use, while coal demand will be sticky in developing nations. Enhanced demand and price seasonality adds risks to both producers and consumers of natural gas. There's also inflationary pressure on gas demand. For example, there's marine bunkering sector, which provides access to growing sector to displace oil demand. The growth in associated gas supply from oil production will continue to create supply push. The displacement of coal in power generation will continue to provide opportunities for gas if prices are competitive. So here was, overall, I gave you a picture of how the natural gas and hydrogen could interplay with each other in the future. With that, I'll hand it over to Peter to give you a more broader view of the overall energy transition in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. I would now like to invite Dr. Peter Zinowski, Lead Energy Analyst, World Energy Outlook at the International Energy Agency, to share more about natural gas and hydrogen in IEA's climate scenarios. Dr. Zinowski, please.
Thank you very much. Hope everybody can hear me. Thanks for the invitation to Liana, Dexter, Kylie, and others for the great support. My name is Peter Zinowski. I'm the lead gas analyst for the World Energy Outlook at the International Energy Agency. So in the brief time I have today, I'm going to consider where we are today in terms of global emissions, what we have to do to reach net zero, and what role natural gas and hydrogen can play in that pathway. So next slide, please. What you'll see here is where we are with emissions. So if you just click one more time. Emissions have fallen by a record 6% last year after the COVID-19 pandemic, but they are now undergoing a very rapid rebound. So in our latest global energy review, we find that CO2 emissions are heading for their second largest annual increase ever. And that's really in lockstep with the economic recovery. So emissions are going to rise by about 1.5 billion tons, and that reverses around 80% of last year's decline. Much of this is driven by a rebound in coal use in China, especially in other parts of Asia. If we click through again, the question is, what about the long-term trajectory for emissions in our climate scenarios? So we have our stated policy scenarios where we reflect all the energy and climate targets and ambitions that the government set out. And so here you see that trend is really plateauing emissions, but really quite far from where we need to go to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in the STEP scenario, we have a temperature increase of around 3 degrees Celsius. Now, this future is not set in stone. And what we've done is analyzed a trajectory where the world reaches net zero emissions by 2070. And that's our Sustainable Development Scenario, or SDS. Now, if you click one more time, we've seen an increasing number of countries, including the European Union, the UK, China, Japan, Korea, and many, many others, making pledges to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050, or even earlier in some cases. So together, these countries account for about 70% of global CO2 emissions, and that really gets us more than halfway to where we need to be in 2050 in terms of emissions. But the remainder of those emissions are in countries that haven't yet formulated long-term net zero targets. But nonetheless, what we've done recently through our net zero roadmap is explore what it would take to reach net zero emissions even sooner, so by 2050 globally. And this would limit the temperature rise to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. So if you click through again, you'll see our, one more time please, the net zero emissions trajectory, which takes us to net zero by 2050. And achieving this will really require a far-reaching set of actions going above and beyond the SDS, which is already quite ambitious. And these actions need to be carried out now at a time when the world is trying to recover from the global COVID-19 pandemic. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at what role gas plays in these last two climate-driven scenarios, the SDS and the net zero roadmap. So we'll start with SDS first and explore what happens to gas in this scenario over the next sort of 2 decades. So as ever with gas, the answer is very complicated and really depends on where you are in the world. So gas can play a role to wean industries off coal, especially in Asia, or oil in the Middle East, Whereas in more mature markets, such as Europe and North America, we see competition from renewables in the power sector. We see stricter building codes and efforts to improve efficiency. All these have a very dampening effect on the growth in gas demand. And so the result is what you see here. Around 1.5 trillion cubic meters of gas is displaced by things like efficiency, renewables, and electrification. So that's about 40% of today's demand displaced by these forces over the next 2 decades in the SDS. And so really the large scale shift towards wind and solar is kind of the key element here. But this is only really part of the story. So if we click through to the next slide, besides sort of fuel substitution from natural gas, there are other measures in the SDS which affect different parts of the supply chain. So here you see the reduction that occurs as a result of the natural gas industry cleaning up its act on methane emissions in particular. But it also means using renewable energy to power upstream equipment, capturing CO2 that would otherwise be vented, and really minimizing and completely eliminating routine flaring. But above all, the methane issue is really what's striking here, is that there's easy wins for the industry to cost effectively reduce methane emissions, and there's growing scrutiny of this issue through policy regulations, satellite monitoring, and bottom-up assessments. So we at the IEA have a methane tracker that estimates around 75% of today's methane emissions should be reduced by 2030 in both the SDS and the net zero scenario. So beyond that, gas can also play a role, if we click onwards, in displacing other fuels. So here there's the narrative that gas can play a bridging role, as Dexter pointed out, displacing coal. So we put some numbers around this to explore what the potential for gas to step in to replace both coal and oil in those more carbon intensive economies. And this means about 300 BCM of upside for gas demand over the next 2 decades as it displaces coal, especially in the power sector. And finally, the final click here, there are emerging fuels and technologies that can really leverage gas-based infrastructure and ensure a continued future for gaseous fuels, so not just natural gas. And this means installing CCUS in power plants and industrial facilities. It also means an emerging role for gas to produce hydrogen, which we'll discuss shortly, and also a role for biogas and biomethane, which grows to over 200 BCM in our SDS scenario from a very low base. And that really, those fuels replace the need for natural gas in a wide variety of sectors. And so these low carbon gases are really on an upward climb by 2040 and increase their share in overall gaseous fuels. Although natural gas has an important role to play here, the important thing to bear in mind is that the net effect of all these measures is a reduction in natural gas demand by about 500 BCM compared to today by 2040. So that's around 10% lower than where we are today. If we go to the next slide, we can explore what happens not in the SDS, but in the net zero emissions pathway. So that is where we reach net zero globally by 2050. And the first thing to realize here is that unabated coal, oil, and natural gas, they have to go if there is any chance of meeting ambitious climate targets in a 1.5 degree compliance scenario. So especially coal would decline by 90% over the next sort of 3 decades to 2050. And that's even with the large scale deployment of carbon capture, especially in sort of power and industrial uses. Oil demand, likewise, wouldn't return to its 2019 peak. It would decline from 88 million barrels a day in 2020 to 24 million barrels by 2050. So that's a fall of almost 75%. Natural gas is the least penalized fuel here, but that's not really much to celebrate. Demand quickly rebounds from the dip in 2020 and does rise. So there's that bridging role that you might see. But overall, demand is 55% lower than it is today. And there's a huge structural change in where natural gas is used. It's primarily used, around 50% of it is used by 2050 in the production of hydrogen. And so in parallel to this huge and steep decline in fossil fuels, there's a massive ramp up in low emission sources of energy and a huge increase in electrification. So things like solar and wind capacity additions are more than 1,000 gigawatts per year by 2030. And so wind and solar provide around 40% of electricity generation in 2030. Electric car sales rises nearly 20 times from just over 3% of sales today to over 60% by 2035. There are no more internal combustion engines sold globally. So that's on the electrification story. If we go to the next slide, we also see a corresponding ramp up in low carbon solids, liquids, and gaseous fuels. So for example, in the solid category, we see a traditional use of biomass falling as this contributes to poor air quality and negative health impacts. And we see modern sources of bioenergy really ramping up to reduce emissions in both electricity, industry, and so on. And that offsets a large portion of the drop in coal demand. Likewise, we see significant ramp up in the net zero scenario in the use of low emissions liquid fuels, ammonia, synthetic fuels, biofuels, and so on. Now for gas, the rise of low emissions gases, hydrogen, synthetic methane, biogas, and biomethane rises from 2 exajoules today to 50 exajoules in 2050. So that's an extremely high pace of growth. To put it in context, the increase in gaseous hydrogen production alone over the next decade is twice as fast as the fastest increase in shale gas production in the United States. So really a huge pace of growth. And now in parallel, if we go to the next slide, as we sort of explore how this plays out, in parallel, there's a huge decarbonization of the hydrogen supply chain. So currently there's around 90 million tons of hydrogen produced globally, largely in the oil refining industry and for producing ammonia and methanol in chemicals. And so all of that, or most of that, comes from fossil fuels, mainly natural gas. So that emits around 900 million tons of CO2. So the amount needed of hydrogen increases quite considerably, but also where we get that from also changes radically. So even as demand increases 6-fold to over 500 million tons in 2050, a huge amount of that comes from fossil fuels equipped with CCUS, but particularly electrolytic hydrogen. So what is sort of conventionally known as green hydrogen sees a huge scale up. And overall, we see hydrogen-based fuels accounting for about 13% of global final energy demand in 2050. And that's broad-based growth across what Dex already mentioned were the hard-to-abate sectors: shipping, heavy-duty transport, aviation, and so on. So by 2050, hydrogen is almost entirely based on low-carbon technologies. And this picture is really impossible without supportive policies. So there's several emerging policy ambitions for hydrogen to scale up. China is supporting FCEVs through tax breaks. You see Chile planning for hydrogen exports. Saudi Arabia has ambitions to become the world's largest producer and is building a whole city around it. And the UK is testing hydrogen at scale in its gas grid. So the list goes on here. But the question is whether early targets and these early ambitions translate into shovels in the ground and mass deployment that can keep costs continuing to decline. So that's something we can perhaps discuss in the Q&A. But I'll stop there and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zinowski. I would like to share more on the results of the poll that the audience participated in. So the first question, how does hydrogen impact LNG's role in the future energy landscape? 55% of the participants believe that hydrogen will grow alongside LNG and the two will coexist. For the next question, what will be key to accelerating a low-carbon energy transition? This is very close, but the majority, by a slim margin, believe that technology advancement and innovations will curb carbon emissions. So thank you all who participated in the poll and for sharing your thoughts with us. Joining the first panel discussion are Mr. Fabian Kaur, Global Head of Strategy and Corporate Development, Pavilion Energy, and Mr. Tim Carlson, Executive Director, International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy. Moderating the session is Mr. Dexter Wang, Asia Market Engagement Manager, S&P Global Platts. To pose a question, please use the Q&A feature. Let us know your name and organization, and if your question is directed to a particular speaker. Mr. Wang, please.
Thank you very much, Kali. So thank you very much again for introducing our panelists. With Fabian team, and I think Peter is joining this panel too. We have a very strong panel here, and first a question, I'll start straight. Many coal, natural gas, or LNG a bridge fuel, which will eventually give way to renewables and hydrogen. I think many in the audience have already shared their view, but I just want to pose this question to the panelists. How will natural gas and hydrogen compete in the immediate future as well as in the medium term? I think I'll give this question to Fabian and then Tim.
Thanks, Dexter. I think it's good to frame the situation first. So I think the future energy system needs to be zero or low carbon, and LNG is still a fossil fuel. It is the cleanest burning, but it still generates emissions. So in order to compete, LNG needs to be decarbonized by using the tools we have available to us today to be a relevant transition fuel. I think the focus should be on technology, increasing efficiency, and then we use carbon offsets to mitigate remaining emissions. We need this transition period as we need time to bring down the cost and ramp up production of low carbon fuels like hydrogen. I don't think we can wait until hydrogen becomes commercial or achieve critical penetration before we do something about the climate battle, which current scenarios out there postulate, I think, about 10-20% hydrogen in the 2050 energy mix. But I do think it can be higher than that with the current momentum behind it. So for countries with heavy coal use, we start by replacing coal and oil with gas where feasible, but you must have a clear vision for a low carbon circular economy for the future. I think what we do today is more important for the climate in the long term than what we do in 10, 20 years time. I think the second point I want to make is we do want to adopt a touch of pragmatism for energy source, for any energy source in the future mix. So for hydrogen to compete early at scale rather than later, besides the obvious benefits to the climate battle, it will boil down to economics, how to ramp up production or reduce costs. If it's competitive enough in terms of costs, or just marginally more expensive than LNG, the take-up rate will shoot through the roof. So if we can get landed green hydrogen cost per kilo down to $1.50, I think that's roughly equivalent to about $8 to $10 per MMBTU, or maybe I think about 60 per BOE in terms of oil price, then it's a very, very strong case. I want to highlight the word landed, as a hydrogen transportation cost today is very high and can destroy any business case. Then we look at applicability. We need to be selective on hydrogen applicability. I think Dexter made a good reference to it earlier in your presentation. So different applications have different economics. If you have already sufficient cost-effective, low-carbon alternatives, there's better place to reduce emissions, such as I think home heating, cooking, then it's not worth it. But key is to prioritize the use of green hydrogen in hard to abate sectors, where there's, I think, no cheaper decarbonization options. And I think also to avoid applications which causes carbon lock-in. So in the meantime, I think large-scale local supply chains serving industries seen in Europe will work best. Cement, steel, quite a sizable future market, where I think the cost premium is less prohibitive. Transport, heavy vehicles, but could have an initial slow growth period due to fueling network challenges. It will be more effective to liquefy hydrogen locally to fuel heavy trucks than to transport hydrogen over thousands of kilometers. So I think in summary from my side, I think in the short, medium term, unless the cost and use of hydrogen is subsidized, or the cost of unabated use of, say, fossil fuels is made much, much more expensive, then I will say economic justification for hydrogen could be tough outside its current mainstream use in chems and refining. So, but for hydrogen to compete, you need to roll out the hydrogen infra backbone subsidies. It will also depend on emissions reductions targets, country strategies to achieve them, carbon pricing policies, quotas, obligations, etc., and also energy market design, just to name a few. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabian. Can we hear from Tim? I'm sure you have some different views.
Well, I first of all, thanks very much for having me here. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh nations. In fact, Peter and I think Vivian have covered the ground very well on this. In the discussions at the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, the IPHE, it is very much complementary views around natural gas and hydrogen, especially in the near term, using the natural gas system to build up the capacities, the capabilities to produce hydrogen first through renewables. There's going to be lots of steps to go through to build up the capacity to generate clean hydrogen. And as Fabian mentioned, up to 20% into the natural gas grid of hydrogen mixed. And so that's the opportunity to build some early capacity. And so it's a complementary use within the systems. And then the longer term is a step over. Once it's beyond the 20%, your capacities are in place. Then the question arises, okay, now you go to dedicated hydrogen systems. And that's a fundamental step function change. You build in trunk lines for hydrogen and you make that step function jump. Now, that does not mean that you walk away, obviously, from natural gas as a source of, as was referenced, of hydrogen with CCS. Many jurisdictions are looking at that as a longer term play for them. A lot have their own policy objectives to use renewable energies and others in generating hydrogen, and clean generation is depending on your definition. But others, that natural asset they will use to meet their goals, and through CCS is the most obvious way. So very complementary, step function changes, progression through.
Thank you very much, too. Are the current national and international policies doing enough in scaling up the roles of LNG and hydrogen in the energy transition? I hope you can talk around regulatory regime, subsidies, and country focuses. Can we hear from Ting and then Peter, please?
Yeah, it's interesting. Each country is evaluating their capital and natural assets now related to hydrogen, especially. That's the space I'm in, so that's what I'm aware of. More than 30 plus roadmaps published recently with strategies and documents, international agencies. Peter's organization is coming out with a global hydrogen review soon that will be part of the hydrogen energy ministerial process this fall. So there's lots of work going on around understanding the strategic positioning. And I think the issue here is each country and jurisdiction will have their different perspectives on the four key drivers that in the policy conversations: energy security, energy reliability, there's the economic obligations or economic goals, and economic innovation, jobs, growth, technology, supply chain, and then environment. Climate change is the obvious one, but often the conversations revolve around clean air, local air quality obligations, and things like that the policy conversations really move to. And so the regulatory regimes vary based on what structure is in place in those countries. And often we see conversations around, yes, this is the regulatory regime, obligations for zero emission vehicles. Works great in some areas, possibly not in others. And so those are the conversations that countries are undertaking right now. So in facilitating that scaling up at the IPHE, a couple of things that we are looking at is the need for understanding the methodology of the GHG emissions related to a unit of hydrogen produced. So we're not a standards body, but there needs to be a global perspective and an understanding of how much GHG emissions are related to renewable energy and electrolysis. What is the GHG count? What is it on natural gas with CCS? What is it with coal and CCS? What is it with biomass, et cetera? So we're trying to work on those methodologies and coming to some consensus that we would then take to a standards body. The other is around trade rules. What are the trade rules in place? Right now, volumes of trade in hydrogen are quite low. And so what are the issues around tariffs? What is the issue around the customs obligations? What's the regulatory obligations, safety certifications, those kinds of things that are coming into play? So that's another area where we're looking to understand what the playing field is and what are the issues that countries need to take to make sure that they don't come up to unintended or barriers to trade to get to scale. So those are some of the issues that we are looking at and countries are looking at to help facilitate the scaling up and the role of hydrogen.
Thank you. Peter?
Thanks, Dex, and I couldn't agree more, Tim. I think you laid out all the issues very, very well there. I don't have a great deal to add, to be honest, but I think one of the important things here is that the landscape is very varied, but we're still very much at a sort of low technology readiness level. So the scale up of hydrogen is really what a lot of people have set their sights on. And so, there's always that need to sort of build that bridge across the sort of valley of death where a lot of technologies sort of fall. And I think one of the things that policymakers need to be aware of is because hydrogen is so versatile, you need a strong energy governance ecosystem. So what Tim described there about GHG reporting, about market design, these are all kind of background necessary conditions for a fuel like hydrogen to thrive. It's not as easy as potentially supporting solar and wind, which you can potentially drop in at early levels, and deploy at scale because it's just there to generate electricity. Hydrogen, there's a long and complex supply chain with a lot of uncertainties about how this will scale up. So I think the first thing to do is map the terrain adequately. And so, as we know, we've seen so many strategies and vision documents, but these stretch back not just to the last couple of years, but the last few decades. The US had one in 2002. In the 70s, we were thinking about hydrogen after the oil crisis. I mean, not we, I wasn't born then, but I'm just privy to the new wave here. And so to make it different and to make it sort of achievable and successful, I think you need that ecosystem in place. And so policymakers should think about that. I think in parallel, they need to think about what type of business models can actually unlock hydrogen scale. Because of course, the early period is public support, R&D, and so on. Governments play a strong role. But afterwards, you really need the scale of private capital to kind of step in and sponsor bankable projects. And so how you reach that stage is another sort of key question on the financial side. Who's going to develop it? Where are the subsidies? Where do you target it best? These are all open questions, and they'll all differ depending on what government's targets are. But as ever, it's a complicated landscape.
Indeed. Thanks, Peter. So actually, we talked about the cost of hydrogen. Platts has been publishing hydrogen prices across Europe, North America, Japan, and will launch in Australia soon, all on cost of production basis. Hydrogen isn't cost competitive at the moment from production, transportation, and consumption. What can we do to change that, especially on the cost? Can we hear from Tim and Peter?
Sure. Okay. Well, I guess on the there's a number of things that are going on, all in parallel, and we've touched on a lot of these items. But Peter mentioned that there's still TRL, so technology readiness level issues for some. And in fact, I would like to push back a little bit. I think that they're a lot closer to the marketplace. There are already demonstrations that have proved the technologies it's there. It's the scaling. I agree. There are an issue around when you go from a demonstration to a large scale facility production, there are innovations that will be required, and that is a step. And there's a role for government support and mechanisms to make that happen. But for example, the US has just launched the Earth Shot in hydrogen, which is $1 US per kilo of hydrogen within the 1 decade. So they're putting $100 to $120 million into hydrogen R&D efforts per year. The Commission has been doing this for decades, for more than a decade, on innovation and development as well. So that work does need to continue. We don't stop that. That needs to continue. The internal combustion engine innovation is continuing today as well. But so that needs to be in place. That's one thing that is going to be done. The next is around the regulatory frameworks is strong policy signals. And this is what you're getting at in this conversation. The roadmaps, the strategies that have to be put in place, those are going to be key to provide credible strategies with credible targets and report on the progress that provide the confidence for business to take action. And that's going to be this next step, is really having those strategies that are credible in the marketplace that drive decisions by business people. And this gets to my third point, would be around the infrastructure investments that align with the production of hydrogen, renewables with the electrolyzers, natural gas with CCUS, et cetera. Those investments are going to be needed for large scale production. We need the trade methods at scale. It's the bulk shipping. What is the carrier? Is it ammonia? Is it liquid hydrogen? Liquid organic carriers of hydrogen, liquefied hydrogen, those kinds of things, that kind of bulk transport, pipelines, that's the other thing. So significant investment in infrastructure is going to be needed. And then that will lay the foundation for the business case to come forward. And that's a lot of work that the Hydrogen Council, for example, is working on. What are the archetypes of production and development and transportation and use that gives the rationale for the business case for the large volume, large investments in projects.
Thanks, Tim.
Right.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with those points as well. And just, I guess, in terms of the sort of cost reductions, obviously there's a big technological element here. There's a lot of expectations about, the drop in electrolyzer costs, especially. I think today, we have, as I mentioned, 90 million tons of hydrogen produced each year. So I think that's a candidate for sort of, or an early target for demonstrating at scale that you can produce cleaner hydrogen, and there will be a premium associated with it because you're adding carbon capture or an electrolysis component, and that does raise your costs initially. And what you need to do is find a market for that premium gas, that premium hydrogen. And I think that's, again, where these business models come in. And if we, because we're talking about natural gas and hydrogen in this session, it's interesting to sort of think about how LNG got started in the first place. You had these long-term contracts with utilities, which were creditworthy. They had a captive customer base, and they could agree volume and price commitments for 20 years, and it seems to me that kind of scale up that's required in IEA climate scenarios would really need to fall onto that for hydrogen at scale as well. So you'd need those customers to sign those deals. And what that can do is lower your cost of capital for your projects. It can increase the credibility and just generally build up a supply chain around that anchor customer point. So we've seen that possibility of industrial clusters, sort of aggregating their hydrogen demand and potentially building an industry around that, and that could also achieve cost reductions in addition to the technology cost reductions you'd have to see in electrolyzers and the components and so on. So we've done some analysis on that as well, and as Tim rightly pointed out, our hydrogen review will cover some of those topics as well. But certainly those are sort of essential elements to think about when we think about scaling all of this up.
Thank you, Peter. Looking forward to the report. Lastly, I want to touch on the decarbonisation of commodities. For example, LNG and oil. It seems to be the way to go. Will we need a carbon tax, or will we need a national ETS scheme, or voluntary carbon market will do the trick? Or technology-based emission reduction or removal? Can we hear your views from Peter and Fabian?
Yes, so that's something that we also closely follow, and so we're encouraged that there's a strong sort of contingent at COP 2026 supporting the idea of carbon markets, and we're encouraged to see talks led by ministers of Singapore and Norway. So there's really a lot to discuss around this. Things like the treatment of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, how that's going to play out in practice, what to do with legacy Kyoto issues, and so on. So a big sort of item list. But I think, what we support is the menu of options that you just listed there. I mean, a carbon tax, a cap and trade system, technology-based targets and guideposts for that kind of thing. I mean, it's all part and parcel of a decarbonization drive for the wider economy. Now, clearly, carbon pricing plays a very important role to sort of distinguish low carbon technologies and to give them the advantage that they need for rapid transition. And so in our scenarios, we have carbon pricing implicit in our models as shadow prices and fixed sort of exogenous assumptions for how carbon prices grow. And indeed, they grow at variable speeds in different regions, depending on sort of scope assumptions and so on. But in some cases, they grow into the hundreds of dollars per ton, elsewhere less so. But the aggregate result is that you see those kinds of deep decarbonization pathways, especially in sort of hard to abate sectors and sectors where there's perhaps as Fabian mentioned, fewer options to go down. So certainly encouraged by the momentum behind this and definitely sort of keeping a watchful eye on it.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. I would say all of the items you mentioned. But climate efforts actually lie in the actual reduction and removal of emissions. You invest in technology to improve efficiency, or you evolve low carbon or carbon-free fuels like hydrogen into commercially viable alternatives. So I think, I personally think actual reductions should be done before we engage in neutralization, and then subsequent compensation activities using offsets. But before neutralization, like carbon removal becomes mainstream, we need to offset. And this means, I think what Tim was saying, we need to accurately measure the GHG emissions from wellhead to the burner tip. So I think in the LNG industry, we are not only looking at breakthroughs like a large-scale CCS. We look at incremental improvements across the value chain at every single process step to improve efficiency, reduce emissions. So say in the upstream part, pressure pumping equipment run on electric instead of diesel, or in the shipping part, you use of battery gensets on the LNG carriers. So these small incremental improvements in every part of the value chain and the sub-value chain all adds up to a final equation. But we need to do something now and not later. So I do think carbon taxes and the carbon market is one of the tools we have at our disposal now. Carbon offsets are useful while you make the transition to a low carbon lifestyle, and a liquid carbon market will definitely help. But I also want to highlight that allowances and offsets is not an excuse to continue emissions. And if you look at carbon tax, I see it as a means to incentivize greater investments in green hydrogen, low carbon production. But I also want to caveat that the needs of the population need to access affordable, accessible energy should be one of the key considerations for policymakers. I really don't want to get into a discussion on the compliance on voluntary market, because this is an elephant in the room. As you know, it's an artificial market and highly political. I think most of you are aware that it hinges on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which will be discussed at COP26. It's really about Article 6.2, 6.4. So among many of the issues, one of which is whether countries can use voluntary carbon markets to reach their net emissions goal. My personal expectations are a bit tempered for Article 6.4 to become the primary market mechanism within 6.2. Bearing in mind that no agreements was reached on COP24, COP25, which is understandable because each country has its own unique set of requirements and considerations, so there's no one size fits all. So that is why one of the challenges is finding agreement. In finding agreement is the difference in each country's NDCs, how to link up one country's system, which is based on carbon tax, with another one on emissions trading, and not creating the potential for double counting. But I do think fully liquid and functioning carbon market will help in the climate battle to decarbonize existing fuels. But this market needs to have a very good flow of high integrity and quality offsets. Without some of the issues, some of you know, encountered in the previous iteration in the EU carbon markets. Proverbially, I actually think the carbon market train has already left the station. Right? So even if there's no political all-in consensus at COP26, countries will still form regional carbon clubs or even sovereign bilateral agreements. Thanks, Dexter.
Actually,
Yeah.
it's very interesting you talking about the voluntary carbon market. I understand it's very important role played in the carbon neutral LNG trading for the past several dozen carbon neutral LNG trades that are publicized in Asia in the past 3 years. All of them were offset with the voluntary carbon credits, and some of them have higher quality credits involved, some of them not really. Do you think a standardization of this area will make carbon neutral LNG, or in a wider extent, carbon neutral commodity become a mainstream, because now it's only a fraction of the total volume?
I'll take the question. I think a standardized sort of contract will be very, very helpful because I think everyone knows there's differing quality of the different type of offsets out there. There's also some of the issues with, say, you have a MBS, what the forest burns down, and also some of the legacy issues from some of the OCDMs. Let's say if you have them in India or somewhere else, there's a lot of problems with it. But I do think we have a lot of independent organizations, whether VERA, whether GS, who's able to help with verification, providing the standards, so that I think moving forward, I think a standardized contract will definitely help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists.
Sorry.
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, sorry. Sorry, Dex, if you don't mind. I was also quite interested, or my team is quite interested in understanding the emissions associated with an LNG cargo in the first place. So, before we get to offsets and so on, it's also quite difficult, in fact, to sort of associate the entire life cycle emissions to a cargo. And it's harder to do in places like the United States, where you don't know where your gases come from. You don't know how much flaring or how much methane leakage is associated with the cargo, as it makes its way from the Permian or other parts of the country down to the Gulf of Mexico or elsewhere. So that's one of the sort of key things we're looking out for is that there needs to be, in parallel to this sort of offset market and the sort of efforts to reduce emissions in the parts where LNG operators have some line of sight and jurisdiction. Further upstream, it's not necessarily the case, and that's something that I think through the EU's methane strategy, but also other sort of initiatives globally, there's a lot of thinking going on around that. So another thing to bear in mind as we sort of develop these tools.
Indeed, and I know fully aware of the challenges behind all those carbon accounting and fugitive emission, methane leakage, etc. Because Platts recently launched our carbon neutral LNG assessment, for which we had to research on all those carbon emissions at each stage of the LNG production. Thank you very much for our three great panelists for this panel discussion. And if you do have any question in the audience, if you have any question for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A box. And you can also reach out to our panelists individually after the webinar. I'll hand it back to Kylie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Wang. Thank you, our esteemed panelists. Joining the second panel discussion for today are Mr. Mario Franchin, Senior Vice President, Commercial Global Solutions, SNAM, Mr. Vincent Mori, General Delegate, International Group of Liquefied Natural Gas Importers, and Mr. Vicente Pinto, Investment Commissioner for Asia, Invest Chile. Over to you, Mr. Wang.
Thank you very much. I'll just wait for our panelists to be turned live. I can't see them right now. Okay. Hi, Mario.
Hi. Hi, Dexter.
So we're now waiting for Vicente Pinto.
I think my video. Yeah.
Okay.
It's okay.
Thank you, guys. So we'll the second panel we'll talk about. Our focus of the discussion will be on the infrastructure and how hydrogen could be transported, consumed, or produced, with a lot of focus on the infrastructure side. Hydrogen is notoriously difficult to transport. Can we hear from Mario and then Vincente in your understanding and experience regarding how we can approach this challenge? You can talk about domestic or international transmission of hydrogen or whatever topic associated with this, please.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So let me say, first, we have, in my opinion, we have to divide it between domestic and international transport. Now, on the domestic one, I think that we have to use as much as we can the existing infrastructure. If we can consider, for instance, Italy, we have a network transporting gas that now is 70% ready for transporting hydrogen. So I think that this one is going to be the future. So the existing pipeline will transport the new green gases. Right? Now, it becomes more complicated when we have to thinking about to bring gas, hydrogen from another country, because the country maybe where you want to import it is not the condition for producing a very competitive hydrogen. So you have to go to another place. So this is becoming more tricky in a way, because there are technology, they are under development, but still there is no one that now is very 100% ready. If you can consider, for instance, you have a part of pipelines, direct pipelines, but this will depend on the distance and the volumes of hydrogen that we're going to flow into it. And then the other one, you have a green ammonia, and then you have liquid hydrogen, and then also you have a liquid organic carrier. Now, if you compare the three of them, if you compare green ammonia, it's true that now is the technology is there, the carrier, so the ship that can carry ammonia already exists. But now the point is that if you're going to use the green ammonia as the final fuel, okay, this could be competitive nowadays, because it's around could be around $2 and $2.4 dollars per kilogram as a cost, but okay, for transportation. But if you take green ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen, that means that you have to crack at the delivery point. Will be much more uncompetitive and uncompetitive. Because the cracking system exists just for a small quantity. It's not like an industrial technology and so on. Now, so this is for green ammonia. If you take the liquid hydrogen already exists. The technology for liquid hydrogen is very expensive in a way, because you consume a lot of energy. And the point is that they are small scale. So we're talking about a maximum size of 30 tons per day already installed all around the world. The point is that how you're going to transport now, once it's liquid, to another across the ocean or across the sea. And this is the point. It doesn't exist nowadays carrier that can transport this in a big volume. So there are now companies moving on it, and the will take time. Okay? And they can be very competitive in the end. Now, if you take liquid organic exists a couple of technology, but just in the beginning of their growth. So even there, the point is that when they're going to be mature in order to be competitive. So in the end, if you see now, for instance, from now to 2030, 2040, 2050, what we consider that in the end, the liquid hydrogen could be very competitive, once in case that you don't have a possibility to connect with the physical pipeline different countries, because this is in any case, it will be for big volume the most competitive way to transport hydrogen.
Thank you, Mario. Can we hear from Vincente?
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation to be here and with such important panelists. I think that the hydrogen industry really, at least in our case, is not yet developed. So it's really hard to compare at this time, because we are just starting. We know that ammonia is maybe the first product that will be done and will be used directly somehow to produce some local products, like in our case, basically explosives in the north, and all the extra production will be exported and will be exported to ammonia users. So that in that case, as Mario indicated, the transport is already solved, and it's quite competitive. I think that in both cases, maybe as the gas itself will be used directly in our mining sector, and probably with some blending into the actual existing infrastructure for LNG. And but there is a huge thing that must still be developed, and that's a big challenge. That I think to think about competition from one side or the other, or one product to another, it's still very new to be considered, because there's not enough experience in order to really see what will happen. If we think we have the very close experience of renewables, developing renewables, there was not a single solar panel in Chile 10 years ago, and now in 1 year we are doubling all what we have done in the last years, and that has really become very relevant for green hydrogen production. So I think, yes, we have I prefer walking on real things than really closing gaps, because it's very complicated to build on gaps. We really need to build on what is happening, and what is happening is a very, very strong commitment for reduction, emission reduction, and decarbonization goals from everywhere. And that's now I think it's a non-return point that probably COVID has somehow helped us.
Thank you, Vicente. Mario, very quickly, can I hear from you? What do you think is the cost advantage of existing natural gas infrastructure? Could you share some experience from Italy, maybe?
Existing natural gas in terms of for transporting gas, or for future transporting hydrogen?
I suppose both. At the moment, I'm sure the existing natural gas infrastructure, you can transport your conventional natural gas, but in terms of other unconventional natural gas, and also in terms of future usage of transporting hydrogen.
There is no doubt that is very competitive. If you take that, for instance, if you do a new pipeline, hydrogen pipeline, dedicated hydrogen pipeline, the cost could be less than $1 per kilogram. No? Now, if you take the existing one, of course, the cost it will be much lower. No? Now, there are already examples that we did, for instance, in Italy, to transport hydrogen blended with natural gas at 10%, and that this can be an increase. But as I said before, the best way and the most competitive way it will be to use the existing facility. There is no doubt on this. But this will depend on the big volume of hydrogen. So this is the key element. In order to have a big volume of hydrogen, that means that you have a big demand, and this is what we have to create, and all the government has to support on this. If we create a big demand, that means that we also be able to scale up the technology. If you take a parallelism with what happened with the solar panel cost quite a lot 10 years ago. Nowadays, they are super cheap. Right? So what we see is that the hydrogen and the electrolyzers technology, it will follow the same path, but it will be much quicker. No, because now with the climate change, everything is really all the world is now moving faster in this way. So for sure, the existing infrastructure will play an extremely important role for this.
Thank you very much, Mario. Can we hear from Vincent regarding the same topic?
On the question of cost, I think it's important to recognize that affordability of energy is key today. If you look ahead, 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2040 will come from emerging and developing countries. and some of them are located in Asia. And so it's important to make the best use of the existing natural gas and LNG infrastructure to make sure that we create a cost-efficient environment, either for hydrogen, for LNG, or in the future, increasingly for bio-LNG and synthetic LNG, which allow to keep the same infrastructure and use the existing infrastructure, sometimes already amortized, to supply energy to these developing countries. So in our view, the type of technology that will be used, whether it is green or blue hydrogen, whether it is hydrogen from pyrolysis, is not what matters. What matters is to supply clean energy and affordable energy to the world, especially in a post-COVID-19 world where affordability is even more important.
Understand. Thank you, Vincent. I want to turn our topic to something that we mentioned previously, which is blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is produced from natural gas with carbon capture. Can we hear from both Vincent and Vicente on the what you see are the limitations, but also potentials of this technology? Maybe Vincent, you go ahead first.
Yeah, as I said, green or blue doesn't matter. What matters is to be clean. So definitely CCUS will be a key element to decarbonize the gas supply chain and to get to a lower carbon environment. And we think that natural gas can be a major market for the production of blue hydrogen. Of course, scale is vital, and we think that natural gas can enable this scaling up before we get to build sufficient excess renewable capacity, which will allow in turn to create more green LNG produced from water electrolysis. What we need to avoid at all costs is to create a dedicated green LNG right now, which would in turn result in more polluting thermal power being used in developing countries. That's the most important. I think every new kilowatt hour of renewable power needs to be used for electricity to replace coal-fired power plants, and not to create a dedicated green hydrogen capacity. That's the most important. Today, you still have 58% of power generation in Asia, which is fired by coal. And we cannot accept that. We cannot accept that for environmental reasons. Of course, we cannot accept that for air quality reasons. I think being based in Singapore, you know what I mean by air quality. And so that's why we think that natural gas coupled with CCS will be a very essential element to decarbonize.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Can we hear from you, Vicente, from your maybe Chile's experience regarding which route the country is taking?
Well, we are mainly users of natural gas. We had our time where we were connected with Argentina for our supply, but something happened around 2005 that those contracts were difficult to be assumed by Argentina, and we were forced to move very fast to overseas natural gas, and that transition immediately turned that a lot of our generation was shifted from diesel and from moved to mining industries, and started to use gas very importantly, and we developed several kind of infrastructure required for this, and now this is very useful, absolutely. And I agree with Vincent that or Vincent, which is we need natural gas in this bridging of this transition. However, now we have seen that with the decision of coal phasing out all of our coal generation, which is already in a plan, agreed with the companies and also accelerated even to what the original goal was on 2040. Now we started maybe 10 years ago with our renewable plan, and this has definitely turned everything in a different way of looking. We placed our NDCs and we placed our decarbonization, and we have placed a continuously increasing. To yesterday, we were seeing that the percentage of renewables is going to be even more increased in a quite in the couple of weeks, and the next months will be this legislation will be placed. So natural gas it's very useful. We will not use it for producing hydrogen, of course, because our potential in renewables is so big, and it's absolutely now oversized. We have now the capacity to double what we request in this term, and the investment has been really flowing in, and then we are, as I told you before, we are doubling this year what we had done in 10 years in terms of production, but we are still using a little amount of that energy. So the mining companies are shifting from their energy contracts based on other fuels to renewables, even paying strong fines. But the cost is really low because of natural conditions. So we probably didn't have any kind of fossil benefits from since ever, but we do have a lot of renewables with very low cost and very high capacity factors that you cannot really find them, and that's why we have been hearing continuously about new investments coming and in the pipeline for environmental assessment, and yeah, it's more or less that's what we see. So it's something that's must be considered together, and that the mix is everything. The thing is scaling up both. It's a big challenge.
Thank you, Vicente. Next, I want to discuss some growth points of the for demand of LNG and hydrogen. And first of all, I wish to bring your attention to the maritime sector. As some of you know, that LNG has been a bunkering fuel for many years actually, and Rotterdam, being the world's largest LNG bunkering port, has seen exponential growth in LNG bunkering demand, and Platts has been assessing the LNG bunkering costs for both Rotterdam and Singapore for quite some time now. So I wish to hear from Vincent, and Vicente, please feel free to add on. How do you think the maritime sector or any other small-scale usage of LNG and hydrogen can be enabling partner for these two fuels?
Thank you, Dexter. Yes, indeed, we see the maritime sector as a growing market for LNG as a fuel, and also as an enabling partner for the development of hydrogen. We see, of course, LNG as a fuel growing. This year, about 20% of new orders placed for vessels were LNG fueled. We have about 20 bunkering vessels which are available today, and in 2023 we will have 45 bunkering vessels available worldwide. So it's definitely growing, a growing market, both for short sea shipping but also for ocean-going vessels. We've had in November last year the biggest bunkering of a container ship by Total, which was 17,000 cubic meters of LNG supplied to a container ship of CMS CGM. And so these are really great milestones for the industry. And I'd like to highlight that we are not talking about only conventional LNG. We are talking here about LNG, which was 13% bio LNG. So you see, we are already shifting from unabated gas to abated gas and bio LNG, and in the future, increasingly synthetic LNG will be allowing to use LNG as a fuel in the maritime sector. Now, to answer your questions more broadly, we see ports and LNG terminals are really the perfect environment for developing hydrogen locally, because ports are very often located close to industrial centers, LNG terminals as well. LNG terminals are used to importing cryogenic fuels now for many years. The LNG industry has been around and functioning safely for 50 years. Which is not the case of hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels. So we have the experience, we have the infrastructure which allows to import gas, to import LNG, and to use it as a fuel for shipping. Today, there are 120 locations where you can bunker LNG worldwide in different ports. And we really see ports and LNG terminals as potential hubs and clusters to import, store, and distribute LNG locally to the industrial sector and to use it also for transport, for heavy transport, and for maritime transport. When I talk about industry, I just want to come back to what Vicente was mentioning earlier. He was mentioning the very quick uptake of renewables in Chile. Of course, you see a very quick uptake of renewables in the power sector, but let's not forget that LNG and hydrogen are allowing to supply energy to the most difficult to electrify sectors. It was mentioned in the first panel, like the chemical industry, the steel industry, aviation, and so on. And this, so really, you have to think that in terms of providing high temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius, today you don't have any alternative. So you have to use LNG, which will be progressively cleaner. We need to continue to clean up the LNG supply chain. We need to offset the residual emissions that we cannot avoid or reduce. But we see a strong future for LNG as a fuel, and also for increasingly in the future, when these technologies become available, for synthetic LNG and for hydrogen-based fuels, green ammonia, methanol, and so on. So there will not be one single solution, but today, bio-LNG, synthetic LNG are already available to be used without changing the existing infrastructure and the existing ships and engines. They can use exactly the same fuel. And what Fabian was mentioning in the first panel is very important, is that we need to decarbonize now, not in 15 years, not in 20 years, because all these emissions that will be produced today will have an impact on climate in the next decades.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
Yes.
Vincente, you have something?
Yes, no, just to comment. Yes, I absolutely. It's talking to LNG is like talking to a big brother. Of course, there's a lot of experience and there's a lot of development that has been done in LNG, and that's the path that we expect to have in LNG, having LNG plus some surnames like carbon capture, the LNG, and then bio LNG, etc. Because we think that the main target is reducing emissions, and that's why we are focused in doing that, not only in the electric power generation, which is certainly the main driver, but there's enough energy in our renewables in order to produce other kind of derivatives and carriers, and that's why we signed some agreement, an MOU with the Rotterdam port, and the idea is to work deeper in ammonia. But I am sure that ammonia will be probably one of the fuels in the future. Hydrogen is not a fuel yet; it's just starting to be a fuel. So I think it's definitely several ways to reach decarbonization, and LNG is one of them, surely, and with a surname, and hydrogen surely is also, and it is quite agreed.
Thank you, Vincente. I actually have a very interesting question from some of the audience in the Q&A box. So one of the questions is, what's the potential of hydrogen to become a clean fuel for power gen? So basically replacing LNG in terms of power generation using hydrogen. Do either of you have any view on that?
Well, there's some experiences. I think that directly as hydrogen, there's some experiences in that have been done. Probably they need to be scaled up here in Japan, and there's some very interesting plans that will be probably launched in this year or maybe the next in Vattenfall, and then that's 100% hydrogen as a turbine generation system based 100% on renewables. So that's very attractive. We haven't placed it as in our strategy as a part of the probably to replace some. We have been following very closely or the experience here in Japan with cogeneration with coal plants as an intermediate things, but we have not planned to do it. I understand that Japan is very focused on this kind of fuel, in this case ammonia, in order to be used immediately and that's what the demand is going on, probably initially with blue hydrogen and coming up with the carbon reduction targets, very stressed for 2030, that both will be somehow fueling or co-fueling the coal plants for generation, which are very relevant in Japan.
Thank you, Vincent. Vincent, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there are some interesting projects like the Brunei to Japan hydrogenation supply chain, where you have a liquid organic hydrogen carrier imported into Japan. It's important to highlight this fuel is produced based on natural gas produced in Brunei, and it's used and it's burnt along with natural gas in gas-fired plants in Japan. So really, there is a complementarity between hydrogen and LNG that you have there. Now, that being said, the most efficient ways to decarbonize are, of course, either to use renewables or LNG or a combination of both to decarbonize. And that's probably the most efficient, the most affordable way to decarbonize. And right now, I would say that the main sector for the use of hydrogen remain industrial sectors and transport, and demand for hydrogen in power is much more uncertain, and there are reasons for that.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I think we've used up our time for our two panels, so I'll hand it back to Kylie.
Thank you very much, Dexter. Thank you very much, Vincent and Vincente. And for all our other panelists who have joined us earlier today, thank you for the engaging and insightful session. We've come to the end of the SIEW Energy Insights webinar. Do note that a recording of this session will be made available online. We would love to hear your thoughts on the experience. Please complete the feedback form that is displayed on the screen. Before we close this session, I would like to thank once again SIEW's partner, S&P Global Platts, for collaborating with us to bring this webinar to you. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to meeting all of you at SIEW 2021.